He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
The Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called The Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical inner tube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
to interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Are you used to it yet? Daylight savings time, the sun coming up at a different time and going down at a different time, and losing an hour of sleep. It always seems to throw people off, that time change. And it looks like some people are ready to do something about it, but are they doing the right thing? So naturally, we had to go to a sleep expert to find out about that. So welcome, Dr. Seema Khosla. She is a board-certified internal medicine, pulmonary disease, and critical care doctor. She's also into sleep medicine, and she works in Fargo, North Dakota. She's the medical director of the North Dakota Center for Sleep, and she is chair of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine Public Awareness Advisory Committee. Welcome, Dr. Khosla.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about just the things that it does to your body when you have to go spring forward or fall back. What kind of weirdness happens in your body that we get so discombobulated by this?
You know, it's so funny because we have joked for years that we just need to stop having clinic that Monday because everybody is cranky. Yeah. Nobody has slept enough.
Yeah.
And statistically, we see just a sharp increase in motor vehicle collisions. We see more heart attacks and strokes and hospitalizations. And what's also kind of worrisome is we see an increase in medical errors.
Uh-oh.
Oh, goodness.
That's not good. And why is it happening? Why do people's brains get all foggy when they lose an hour of sleep or even when they gain an hour of sleep down in the fall?
Well, and that's just it, right? That we're losing that hour of sleep. So we know from all of that good work that's been done on delaying our school start times, we know that even a little bit more sleep is helpful, right? It's helpful for the kids when they get just a little bit more sleep. They perform better academically. They have lower high risk activity like drugs and alcohol and that sort of thing, fewer motor vehicle collisions. Sleep deprivation is a serious thing. And so we are a nation that is chronically sleep deprived, and we're just not good at figuring that out, right? If you've been up all night with a screaming kid or an exam or on call or something like that, that's a no-brainer. You know you're tired, but it's that chronic sleep deprivation that we just don't recognize, where maybe we get 6 hours of sleep on a regular basis. And we are much more tired than we realize. And so our reaction time is worse. You know, we're inattentive. And so it's a significant thing. And I love how the default, love hate, obviously. Yeah. But the default when you said that we all lose that hour of sleep. Well, you know, it's an hour. It's up to us to decide whether it truly is us losing an hour of sleep, or should we maybe be losing an hour of social media scrolling?
Right. It seems as though it's really true, just judging from your comments so far, that our culture is more sleep deprived than others. And I think we have the sense that we're all sleep deprived. I know when we had two kids and we were working our jobs, we used to walk around like zombies. I mean, for years on end, right? So I'm wondering whether that is true. Is it true that we're worse than other cultures, as far as you know?
I think culturally, yes, but I'll put a little asterisk here. Through the pandemic, and I'll preface it by saying I'm a silver lining girl. So I think one of the things we learned through the pandemic is that some people were able to extend their sleep time, right? Because they didn't have to commute anymore. And they didn't have to be in their office at 8 a.m. and sort of those work hours loosened. And so then people, sure, were staying up later, but they were also sleeping in. And so what we saw was this population, and I'm talking about the people who were sort of in these Zoom neighborhoods, not the frontline workers that had the added stress and, and sort of carried that burden for us, right? But the people that were able to have more control over their work hours, people who had been chronically tired all of a sudden weren't tired anymore.
Yeah. And it's weird because if people are left to their own devices, if they're told, like in the pandemic, when everybody suddenly was at home and couldn't go to work, if they're left to a schedule that isn't regulated by the clock, where do they naturally fall? Is it natural for them to sleep in a little more and stay up a little later at night?
Yeah, we all have our own circadian preferences. I was speaking to a friend of mine, and she says, no matter how bright the light is, if it's 9:30 at night, she's going to fall asleep because she's a morning person. And so, yeah, we are just biologically programmed, either early or late. And what we do see, though, as a population is our adolescents, is that it's very normal for them to delay their sleep phase, meaning they stay up later and they wake up later in the morning as well.
Now, I remember a time when I was working for CNN in Atlanta, and Atlanta had very, very strange daylight. And I remember I had to get up for a particular shift a couple days a week where I had to be into work at 4 a.m. It was still light at 10 or 10:30. And I was desperately trying to block the light in my room so I could get some sleep. And I couldn't. I mean, I put the blackout curtains. Actually, I didn't have blackout curtains. I put a big blanket over the curtains to try to create a blackout. But it did seem to me like my whole world was kind of fuzzy for the next couple of days, trying to get sleep when I shouldn't be sleeping because it was light out. I had that kind of feeling.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? That, we know that. So the greatest, what we call Zeitgeber, which is this wonderful word, and I think it's German, but it basically is this cue. So sunlight in the morning is this wonderful Zeitgeber that allows our bodies to know that, okay, this is morning time. And then it sort of counts down when it starts to need to make melatonin. And so by us not having that light in the morning, which is what this proposed, permanent daylight saving time would be, but then we're also having light later than we should. That is going to make it harder for our brains to know, right, that it's time to go to bed.
If we don't change the time, we will have different parts of the year where we get up in darkness or go to bed when the sun is still above the horizon, right? We'll have to get used to really the natural sunlight periods.
Well, and before the advent of electricity, we used to sleep in 2 sleep periods. So we would go to bed when the sun went down, right? We would sleep for 4 hours or so, and then we would tend to the fire and visit our neighbors. And then we would go back for what was called our second sleep. So now we're just sort of squashing it all into one nocturnal sleep period. But then you're right. You're sort of, you're shaving off a little bit here because it's pretty light outside. And I think the challenge with this so first of all, I applaud them for even talking about this. So I'm very excited about that.
This is the Senate passing a bill that says daylight savings time year round. We won't have to change the clock.
Right. So I applaud them even considering this. I think we are all in agreement that we all hate the switch. We all hate that change, right? Even though it's easy now, right? Because half of our clock's set automatically. It's just that physiological change we all hate. But I think it's important for us to have good, robust conversation around this. So it went to the Senate. It was this unanimous decision, but very little debate. And so in my mind, I just can't help wonder what that decision might have been if the vote had taken place not in March, but in November.
Yeah.
How different would it have been?
Yes.
Because that's the challenge, right? That for a lot of the country, we won't see sunrise until 9 or 9:30 in the morning. And so then you're putting your kids on a bus early in the morning and it's dark.
And the stars are out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worrisome.
I mean, people haven't actually had this experience, right? Where
Right.
the hour is always the same time, but it might not be the same sunlight.
Well, that's exactly it. I think for most of the country, it's a very popular decision. And I think part of that is psychologically we marry the spring with the spring forward.
Yeah.
And so it's not that we have any control over how long the sun is shining in the course of the day, right? It does not care what our time is. but this idea of all of a sudden we notice a lot more sunlight, right, around this time. So we associate this in a very positive way. But we do need to be thoughtful about this and really look at, well, what does that mean in November, in December for winter solstice, right? The shortest day of the year. How much sunlight the actual amount of sunlight isn't changing. It's just that timing. And so, they tried this, right? They tried this in 1973 and it was hugely popular when they started, but then it became vastly unpopular and they had to rescind it in less than a year.
Yeah, I understand it was supposed to go for like 2 years and it only lasted for 9 or 10 months.
Yeah, they had, car accidents and they, it was terrible.
Well, when you're talking about shifting to the point where kids have to go on the bus in the starlight and maybe they come home in broad daylight, it does get me thinking about December and January where the days are very short. And when you're going to work in the dark and coming home in the dark, that can be a depressing thing as well. So would staying on standard time shift that around, or that's pretty much, we're in standard time when that happens, right?
We're in standard time. The challenge is that, it's hard, especially for mental health, sunlight is important. And yes, there's absolutely a group of people that, we have the winter blues and that sort of seasonal affective, but yes. And there is this other group of people that actually feels worse in the summer. But that aside, that idea of our circadian rhythm is very closely aligned to the solar clock, meaning the sun. And so then when we're proposing this shift of an hour, we will be persistently misaligned for a long period of time. And so they studied this in Germany. And what they found is that you have sleep loss of about a half hour every night until you switch back.
There's a natural lag time. And you're, I'm just amazed at how the body does what it knows how to do without asking you, right? That the body just goes ahead and does what it knows how to do.
Well, and I think, sleep is a very, very young field, right? And so the researchers in sleep and circadian science, the circadian rhythm researchers won the Nobel Prize, I want to say maybe 2017. So not that long ago, so this is compared to other fields, right? It's still pretty young. And so there's a lot that we're learning about it, but that circadian clock is present on a cellular level. It's such a consistent thing in our bodies. Different hormones are released different times and different, there's so much that is that relates to. Yes. And so then this idea of sort of throwing it off kilter can be alarming. And I'm kind of the opinion that it's okay to disagree, right? And I think there needs to be room for conversation because I absolutely understand that there are financial considerations, right? Like the golf courses want people out golfing. Totally get that.
Yeah. right. Right.
And part of the reason why we switch in November is because Candy wants the kids out trick-or-treating for another hour. Totally get that. Right?
Yes, sure.
Totally understand that.
Yeah.
And so I think it would be lovely to have this conversation where all of these vested stakeholders can hear one another, right? Again, it's totally okay to disagree, but let's at least have the conversation and let's have that conversation in a respectful way.
I was reading an article where it said that the unanimous vote by the Senate was kind of a smokescreen because Senator Rubio from Florida was the sponsor of the bill. And as I understand it, he pulled some sort of parliamentary maneuver where he took it out of the committee where it had been being debated and put it on the floor for a vote. And it was voted in 2 seconds. Right. And that's it. So, yeah, there wasn't much of a conversation. And you're right. I think maybe, I'd hate to disabuse anybody of their ideas of how noble people are in the Senate. but I think
the widespread belief of the perfection of our public servants. Yes.
Exactly. But I do believe that probably a big hand in it was, you're right. There are so many things to do if the daylight goes until 8, 9, 10 o'clock. There's so many things to do after work. The businesses want you up and around that maybe that had some sort of a sway in getting it passed that way. I'm just speculating here,
No, but it's true, except evidently the movie industry, because they know that if it's light out, you'll be outside and you won't go to the movie theater. And so it's so interesting, these competing interests over just an hour.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, when you consider, it's a strange country we live in. We have very few holidays compared to other places. And one of the reasons for that is that business does not like holidays. They need to stay open to make money. Every time you add a new holiday, that's a certain number of billion dollars that are not made.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I can't blame them for that. It's their job to run the business, and they know what they gain and lose. And I think the discussion we're having right here has the same kind of sense to it, because there are going to be times when it's really good for the movie theaters and other times when it's really good for the golf courses.
Right. And so I hope that somewhere along the line that people do listen to the people that understand sleep and circadian research, because it is an important consideration, right? Like, just thinking about our children, thinking about all of that work about the school start times, and just in one fell swoop, how we can undo all of that work.
We'll have more with Dr. Khosla in a moment. But first, this soothing musical Innertube. Dr. Seema Khosla previously served on a task force on sleep telemedicine for the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. It studied the use of telemedicine for the diagnosis and treatment of sleep disorders.
Dr. Khosla runs a telemedicine outreach program that serves rural areas in North Dakota and has done so for the past decade. She also hosts a podcast for the AASM. It's called Talking Sleep.
You can find out more about Dr. Khosla and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine by logging on to aasm.org.
And now let's return to the musical Innertube.
Your idea, or I don't want to say your idea, but sleep people in general would prefer, if we've got to change this and go to one-time standard or one-time thing all year long, standard time would be the one that we would
That's
prefer.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not just a whim either. There was a committee that involves circadian researchers and sleep clinicians. And so they developed a position statement, and they looked at this data to really come up with, what they felt was the right way to go. And so it's not just a whim. It comes after lots and lots of effort and research.
What sort of things can people, since you said everybody's circadian rhythms are different, and maybe they're not, different in a wide range, but
right, not hugely different.
Yeah. What can people do to get back in line with their circadian rhythms? You were talking earlier about applauding some school districts starting high school later because it's better for high schoolers to sleep in a little bit.
Because they're night owls.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because what we were doing when we were asking them to wake up early is we're missing that nice, beautiful, and it's our longest stretch of REM sleep. And REM is really important for mood, and so we're just sort of getting rid of it because they're hitting the REM cycle when they're in their first period, and, and that's not great. So this is kind of a running joke in our family. We had this fish, and depending on the time of year, I would adjust my fish's circadian rhythm by sort of flicking on and off like the light. And so it kind of became, so around the time of the time change, I have to change the circadian rhythm of both my dogs, or else they're going to want to be fed right at the wrong time, and, all of the stuff. And so I gradually shift, 10, 15 minutes a day before and you don't just shift bedtime. Okay. You shift exercise time and meals and TV, you shift everything. Ooh. And so then if you really want to get creative, then you start doing bright light in the morning, maybe a little melatonin in the evening, not right before bed, but 2 or 3 hours before bed.
Oh, I didn't know that part. Oh.
Yeah, melatonin is very interesting. And you don't need a ton of melatonin, just a tiny little sniff and, like 0.5 milligrams, and again, it's not, medical advice because it's not anything that is FDA approved, but it is something that, when we're talking about shifting somebody's circadian rhythm, that light therapy we will try. And for the right person, we might consider a little melatonin too.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that I take melatonin to try and help myself sleep. And I didn't know you should take it, 2 hours, did you say?
Or 3, yeah. Unless it makes you too sleepy. But that's it. Our goal is to emulate our natural release of melatonin, right? And so that happens with dim light in the evening. And it's part of our wind down routine, right? Because the expectation is not that we pop a pill and then, we're out till next Tuesday. It's sort of this.
Right.
Well, how important is that rhythm too? I've read where you need to do the same things all the time in order to get ready for bed, in order to put your head in a mind set,
Absolutely.
if you will.
Yeah. It's unrealistic to go 90 miles an hour during the day and then, right, just turn it off, go to bed. It's just not realistic. We're just not programmed that way, right? And so absolutely, and so there's a little debate about blue light, is it harmful? Is it not harmful? I think the whole idea is what we're doing on our phones is very stimulating, right?
Yes.
And so depending on the person, right? Like some people can have coffee and they can go to bed. Everybody's different. But that idea of creating a wind down routine, some of it is psychological, that once I start doing step number 1, I know my end result is step 10. Right. And so psychologically, you just sort of get ready to go to bed.
I think Don and I are sort of the same. For many years, you'd work all day and then just crash, just throw your body into bed. You don't really have a routine. I think it's later in life when you realize, well, what do I do before I approach bedtime? What you mentioned something about there are a certain number of people who like a cup of coffee right at the end of the day. I could never figure that out because I need a cup of coffee like a moose needs a hat rack. I am so jacked, and Don will testify to this. I'm very hyperactive. If I had a cup of coffee, I would not sleep much. And
if we're talking about people in their 20s, they're usually going to bed with an awful lot of alcohol in them.
College students
when they wake up in the morning.
Yeah,
that's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah.
Alcohol is kind of this interesting.
But
and the thing about caffeine is that there's the perception of it doesn't keep me up, but then there are some studies that demonstrate that if you have caffeine before you go to sleep, you'll sometimes see changes on your EEG in the sleep lab. And so so sometimes you'll see a shift in your EEG. So those brain waves where it looks like you're trying to wake up. Okay. And it's just a 3-second shift. So you're not aware of it. They're called arousals. And so sometimes we'll see, more arousals, a little bit harder for someone to fall asleep. Sometimes their legs start going, and so it's a very interesting, there's definitely a disconnect between perception, right? And then what you can see objectively.
Let me sound like an old fart here for a second. But as I
we can say
older,
that on this show. We can say,
all right. Yeah. So I am an old fart, all right? But no, seriously, over the last few years, I have noticed that I will go to bed at a normal time for me, around midnight or something. And then at like 2:00 in the morning, I will wake up and I am awake. And there is nothing that I flop in bed, and eventually I have to turn the light on and get up and move around a little bit. And eventually I'll get back to sleep. But what's the deal where I sleep for 2 hours pretty soundly, and then all of a sudden I am awake and nothing's going to put me down? What's my circadian rhythm doing in that?
Oh, I don't know if it's your circadian rhythm. Is it something else, right? So 2 hours into sleep is for a lot of us is when we start hitting REM. And REM is where we have those wonderful watching a movie kind of dreams. Okay. But our muscles are paralyzed, so we can't act out those dreams. And for some of us, we have more sleep apnea during REM. Sometimes you only have sleep apnea during REM. So then you'll have an apnea and you wake up and you're like, why am I awake? What's happening? My heart, something's happening. And then you're sort of, jacked up. It's hard to sort of calm down and go back to bed.
And so that's I'm not weird. That happens to a lot of people, right?
It does. But you may want to consider having it checked out a little bit.
Oh, all right. See if there's an apnea going on. Is that?
Yeah, you may want to consider that.
Okay. I don't want to wear one of those masks. I'm sorry.
Yes. And Don, that's just one of many things I hope you get checked out. I wanted to go back. To go back to the alcohol thing, because you alluded to the fact that alcohol is a big topic. And how much does it mess with the natural arrangement?
So it's not great. Alcohol it's very interesting. It suppresses REM sleep. And then as you metabolize your alcohol, sometimes people will get a lot more REM sleep. And so sometimes because of that, some people get more apnea during REM. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of this REM rebound and then a lot of apnea, but alcohol itself can make your sleep apnea worse. And so some people only have sleep apnea when they drink and not at all when they don't drink. Okay. So it's just one of those other factors, right, to consider. And sort of hitting on what you had mentioned earlier about, I don't want a CPAP. Totally get it. and so the whole idea is that it's not about sort of, if somebody has sleep apnea, it's not about shoving everybody into the same box, right? It's more important, okay, do you or don't you? And then let's explore different ways of treating it, right? It doesn't have to be a CPAP, right? There's lots of, because it's just, if you think about it, it's just like your airway's collapsing, right? Nobody's holding their breath on purpose.
No.
So you just splint it open, right? With pressure, or you just make it bigger. You do a dental device and it just pulls your jaw forward, right? There's an implantable device or something you wear in your nose. I mean, there's tons of ways of treating it.
What about those strips that you're supposed to put over the bridge of your nose that will open it up? Do those work?
They help improve like your nasal patency, but they're not necessarily meant to treat sleep apnea by itself, right? Mm-hmm. But there's one that goes in your nose that's like a valve. And there's no mask, there's no machine or anything. And so it's kind of cool. It's this valve. So you breathe in, the valve opens, you breathe out, the valve closes. And so it traps air in your airway to kind of keep your airway open. Bottom line is that everybody's different. It's like anything else, right? There's not just one choice for blood pressure medicine or diabetes medication, right? There's not just one treatment option for sleep apnea. There's tons. It's hugely prevalent.
I can be a RoboCop, basically. Stuff implanted in there.
So let's say that we go to one time. What would we look for to change in our national lives? I mean, will we have fewer car crashes? I don't know. Better grades in school? What do you think?
So I think the easiest way that we're going to tell the difference is when we compare like week, year over year for that same week, just because we know that there's a sharp spike, right? So you would assume, and that's not, we still have to study this, but you would think then if you're not having that acute sleep loss of an hour, that's going to level out and you're not going to have this spike. That would sort of be the ideal. I'd be very interested to look at that data from Arizona, for example, because they stay on permanent standard time, and to see if there is a discrepancy. When you go from the easternmost part of a time zone to the westernmost part of the same time zone, there is a gradient in terms of heart disease and cancer risk and that sort of thing. And so, it's just something that hasn't been studied as extensively. Maybe now we should.
So you can go from, I don't know, the Jersey Shore and go all the way to Pittsburgh, let's say, whatever the beginning of the next time zone is, and you're going to see differences. Mm-hmm. Just within, that's amazing to me.
Well, and the other thing that was kind of interesting that somebody pointed out about the Senate vote is that the people who were most in favor of it were the ones that aren't on the edge of the time zone that are going to have the really dark mornings.
Yeah,
I can see that. Yes.
And so it may not be as big a deal to them.
Right.
So we still don't know a lot about sleep. We're still trying to figure out what's going on. And in that context, should we be messing with our hours or should we just settle on something and plunge forward and see how we do?
So, when I was talking to my husband about this, and he's a nurse, he's like, why don't y'all just split the difference, right? Move it a half hour, park it there, call it good.
Yeah.
I thought,
forever.
Right, forever. Just get rid of the switch, split the difference, and everyone will be happy. And I thought, maybe we do need to have a creative way of looking at things, or someone else proposed maybe having like smaller time zones, right? So you don't have this huge swath in one time zone
Yeah.
and maybe have these sort of mini time zones or what have you. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for eliminating the switch. I think that, I love the catch up in the fall. So I'm going to miss that.
Yeah.
But I do not miss the spring forward. I think that's
right. Getting that extra hour.
Mhm.
I used to love that when I was a school
Yeah,
kid.
but you got to wait 9 months to get it. That's the problem.
Right. I know.
I was always on call though when we had that extra hour. I
Oh.
remember that as a resident. I was
Hey,
like,
Your time
Let me
was
tell
your
you,
own.
There's nothing more fun than being an overnight disc jockey during the time change, where you either skip an hour or worse, you have to do a whole hour over again.
so yeah, what do you do then? Do you just say,
you do it? You say it's 2:00 and you play the 2:00 hour, and then when that's over, you say it's 2:00 and you do the 2:00 hour again. Literally, you have to do that. Yeah, it wasn't fun, and I didn't get paid extra for it either. So
Now that's what's
that's
Yeah.
the problem?
So
Oh,
there's
man.
all sorts of potholes in that particular situation. So yeah, all right. Well, let's see what happens in Washington. Let's see if some cooler heads prevail. If they do go to all daylight savings time, if the House agrees and it gets passed, is there anything that, I mean, you said in 1974, everybody, there was a huge outcry. Do you think that might repeat itself?
Maybe. I mean, I think people will just be overjoyed at not having the switch, but I wonder how vocal, especially I feel like people now have a platform, right? That perhaps they didn't have in the 70s. And so I wonder who will be more vocal now.
Dr. Seema Khosla, thanks very much for being on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khosla, for coming on and giving us your expertise.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
The Musical Innertube is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform and give us a good rating.
You can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Two page on the website, and we'll send you a preview of who's coming to talk with us by email, just so you're prepared.
That's musicalinnertube.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.